Okay, ladies and gentlemen, may we begin? So thank you all very much for coming. This is the first of these so-called What's in the News sessions of this term. I'm Bill Emmott. I'm former editor of The Economist. I have the misfortune of not having hired Arkady Ostrovsky. I'm jealous of my successor for having lured him away from the Financial Times, where he'd been for the previous decade or so, and to The Economist in 2007, in Moscow, and now in Britain as Russia and East European editor. Ezgi Basaran here is a notable Turkish journalist, youngest ever editor of Radikal, of a Turkish newspaper. Now here in Oxford at St Antony's College, and you can add two and two together to work out why she might be here, since her newspaper was left liberal, as it's described. We are here, though, to talk about Russia. And let me say, first of all, though, we're here to have a short, sharp conversation about Russia, and the important contributors are first Arkady and Ezgi, and then all of you. We will start with a couple of 3-minute opening statements. Then I will just ask a couple of questions of them, and then I want you to pitch in as vigorously as you can. We'll have a roving microphone. We've come a long way, clearly, with Russia, as actually Arkady's book, The Invention of Russia, tells us, from the period when Western commentators were sneeringly describing Russia as Upper Volta with nuclear missiles, to a presidential debate last night in which the two candidates are vying for which of them is Putin's puppet. We also have moved, when you read in today's Financial Times, the former head of MI6, John Sawyers, say, war between the great powers is once again a possibility. Now, he may, now that he runs a political risk advisory business, maybe he's touting for business. But nevertheless, we obviously need to take this seriously. Where is Russia's intervention in Syria heading? Where is the conflict in Ukraine heading, if anywhere? Is it a frozen conflict? Is it not? How does Russia see its strategy? How should we see its strategy vis-a-vis Iran, China, Russia, Turkey, Europe, and of course the United States? And what might happen under a new administration who we can choose likely to be the next president? Arkady, let's start with you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, it's a great pleasure and honor and privilege to be here and talking to Bill, who I didn't have a great fortune to serve under, but there we are. Indeed, I mean, it is extraordinary how Russia has become the central place, almost, occupies central place in the U.S. debate. 4 years ago, Mitt Romney, the nominee from the Republican Party, famously said that Russia is America's biggest geopolitical threat or foe, and Barack Obama laughed him off and said, "Don't be ridiculous. You live in some, completely in the past in the 80s." And there we are now. Russia is at the center. Subverting U.S. policies in Syria, bombing Aleppo, challenging European security, etc. Now, I'll be very short, and I would like to propose one main thesis. I just finished writing a big report, a special report for The Economist about Russia, which is due out tomorrow. And in doing so, I had to read a lot of stuff. And I must say that the one piece which had most relevance and was most accurate in describing the state of Russia today was written in 1946 by George Kennan. In his long telegram from Moscow, and then followed by his article in Foreign Affairs by Mr. X. The reason it's not some sort of journalistic vignette or just coincidence. The reason this is so is that Kennan was one of a very few people in the West at the time, and probably not just his time, but certainly in 1946 Soviet Union, who managed to see through all the ideological covers of the regime and get to the anatomy of it and describe the state regardless of its ideology, which is something that took a lot of intellectual bravery at the time. Cannon's key thesis and the basis for the policy of containment, which followed, however it was implemented, and Cannon didn't think, and I don't think it was implemented actually in accordance to what his analysis was based on the idea that what drives the Soviet system is its weakness and insecurity. And it's the same insecurity that, and weakness that in the past, before the Soviet Union, has driven the Russian Empire to lash out against the West, a country which has no natural borders, which very often mixed up offense and defense, and saw offense and aggressiveness as a form of defending its inadequate system of government, inadequate in comparison to a Western system of government. So one reason is Cannon's sort of intellectual power that it's relevant. The second reason that analysis is so relevant is that Putin, from about 2004, the end of 2004, has embarked on this path of restoration, which followed a revolutionary decade of the 1990s. And that restoration never leads to the past, it's never permanent, but Putin has tried to recreate, for better or worse, a traditional Russian state, a state which had served both the Stalinist empire and before that, pre-Bolshevik empire. As a result, and what I consider the main weakness of the regime, is an inherent contradiction between that very archaic type of state, absolutist state, corrupt state, all the features of it, and a very modernized, urban, educated middle class, which has become much larger in those years of economic growth under Putin. It's the same conflict which was in place in by 1914, when Nicholas II had this delusion of trying to rule Russia as if, it's like George V would try to rule Britain as if he was Charles I. Russia was already producing great, Kandinsky and Malevich, and yet it was an absolutist power. And I would argue that Putin has driven Russia to a point where we could see a lot more upheaval and possibly further disintegration. So my argument is, yes, Russia is at the center. Yes, Russia is trying to threaten and project power. It's doing so out of insecurity rather than genuine strength. I think there are great differences between Russia and China, where China does see its power mainly lying in the economy, and then everything else follows. And as the Chinese, who are probably some of the best analysts of Russia today, I spent a few days in Beijing and Shanghai over the summer, and their analysis of Russia's weaknesses is very interesting. And their analysis is that whereas we, China, are interested in economy, Russians are always interested in security of their elite, not just even security of the country, but security of the Kremlin. And the final thing I'll say is that, of course, where I think Obama went wrong is I think Obama's assessment of Russia's weaknesses was correct. His logical conclusion from that therefore Russia can be left, alone. We don't need to worry about it. It's a regional power, declining, was wrong. You have to worry about weak powers with nuclear arms a great deal more than about powers like China, which has a lot more to lose economically by confronting the West. So my thesis, Russia is weak and therefore dangerous.
Excellent. Ezgi, how does this look from Istanbul on the Woodstock Road?
Okay. The recent Russian-Turkish rapprochement has been talked in different levels in the Turkish public and in academia. There's this, from the westward-looking seculars and people, the idea is, is Turkey going too far with Russia that would jeopardize its its relations with the West, and also would it cause more problems in Syria and in the Middle East. So and this comes from a belief that Putin and Erdogan are actually very like-minded people. Erdogan accumulates his power from two things that would resonate with any Russian expert or Russian person, that he portrays himself as the underdog and the victim, and also surrounded by enemies who are mostly Western. So this rhetoric unites and consolidates his power very much. We can say that this anti-Western discourse and the sense of victimhood from the West is a common way of steering internal politics for both of the leaders. But the Syrian war, as many of you know, has become a serious rift. But because at the beginning, Erdogan thought that it would be a matter of months that he would pray in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. It wasn't like that. And after Russia, involved in the Syrian war, it just become something of an unplanned epic failure for Turkey. During and after the Russian jet was downed, Turkey realized certain things, that it depends on Russia more than Russia depends on it in terms of trade and energy, but also it cannot compete with it militarily in Syria. And it was not only Syria, which there was another side of the coin that reveals another story. After 2013, because of his illiberal policies of Erdogan had fallen from grace in the eyes of the West. And Erdogan reacted harshly to that change of heart, and having a good relationship with Russia always comes in handy when one gets cross with the West. The coup on the 15th of July bolstered that relationship with Russia and Turkey, because Erdogan was already furious at the EU, because EU for not honoring the visa liberalization, for not keeping their pledge regarding the Syrian refugee deal. And he became even angrier since the EU leaders were either late or weak in their condemnation of the coup, where Putin had risen to the occasion. And, last week, we saw a major construction deal was signed, and two leaders, interestingly, vowed to seek common ground in Syria, which I see very unlikely. There's also another thing. Both Turkey and Russia see Gülen movement, the alleged mastermind of the coup, as evil. Actually, Russia was the first country to close down Gülen schools in 2014. So the common enmity brings them closer at a time when Erdogan believes no country is taking Gülen threat as seriously as they should. So pro-government media in both countries also claim that pilots who downed the Russian jets were affiliated with the Gülen movement. So here's the rationale. That's actually very interesting. The coup that was attempted on 15th of July was actually Russian Russia was also a target because Erdogan was mending ties with Russia. Hence, he was tried to be ousted by the military. So how far will this relationship go is the question. Would Turkey jeopardize NATO membership? But I can say from my first-hand, very, very fresh interviews with certain NATO members, this is, even though we should not overestimate this rapprochement, NATO people, especially the US officers, are taking this very, very seriously at the moment and very unhappy.
Excellent. Okay, very interesting. Now, following on, Russia's weakness. I mean, I suppose if one ingredient of an outsider's incomprehension of Russia's behavior or policy in Syria and in Ukraine could be caricatured as saying, why, if they're so weak, do they incur such costs? Isn't it expensive and risky to lose lives, to spend treasure on foreign adventures?
Well, the foreign adventures don't cost, I mean, these adventures don't cost
expensive.
very much.
Yeah.
And the cost to the Kremlin is a lot less than the risk of losing power. There was a key moment for Putin in 2011, 2012, when the short presidency of Dmitry Medvedev, which was partly used by America to split the Russian elite, to kind of build up Medvedev as a modernizing leader, both by Washington and Berlin, a person easier to deal with, created hopes amongst a lot of Russians that this will, Medvedev's presidency is the beginning of some modernization, etc. And that ended, of course, with Medvedev announcing that this whole thing was a complete sham, that they've planned their job swap. There was a further contempt by the state in rigging the elections, and suddenly you had massive demonstrations in Moscow. And Putin, who is a very cunning, able, clever man, who, of course, observed firsthand in '91 how the communist regime came down. He was on the right side. He was on the democratic side. He had just finished his stint in Dresden in the KGB. And understood perfectly well. I mean, if some of you remember, in August '91, the communists and the KGB tried to bring tanks out in the streets of Moscow. But that didn't get them very far, and 3 days later the coup ended, and Yeltsin won. And Putin knew perfectly well that he couldn't do in 2011 and 12 what China did in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, and he understood that the only way to defeat this broad movement, and the broad movement I would describe as sort of a drive towards a modern nation state, was to defeat it ideologically. And for that he needed a narrative. And Russia is a very idea-centric country. There is a wonderful line in a great poem by Boris Pasternak about Lenin, I think 1928, where he described Lenin as he drove the tides of thought, and through that mastery, the state. Ruling the tides of thought is very important. And he came out with this idea of imperial nationalism, traditional Russian idea, resulting in the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine. And it worked. So the reason he is doing that, but that whole thing, construction, relies on you having, being a besieged fortress, relying on an outside enemy. A lot of it is ideological. It's not that costly. Look, if we extraordinary. My favorite metaphor about Russia is, I was reporting on it at the time, watching the opening of the Olympic Games in Sochi, and they've staged this extraordinary show, the most expensive Olympic Games ever in history, $50 billion, and reporting on all the gold medals. This is Russia's great victories and conquests. Meantime, the FSB, the successor to the KGB, set up a secret laboratory and was swapping urine samples. I mean, can you imagine? this is like MI6, occupied, a lot of people swapping urine samples through a hole in the wall. So, doping its athletes. Well, Russian television and the media and the propaganda is doping the whole country with Crimea and this success in Syria. I think Syria is very dangerous, actually, for them, because I think they are getting stuck. I think the pictures of children, which we've seen, really, really horrific pictures, are not going to go away soon. I think when the Americans and the Germans actually started speaking about war crimes, I think that really has had an effect. I think this is probably one of the reasons why Putin did go to Berlin yesterday to talk to Merkel and Hollande, and I think we will see a change, not necessarily for the better, but we will see a change in their policy towards Ukraine.
Towards Syria?
In Ukraine.
Oh, in Ukraine. Oh, I see. As the trade, I see, yeah. And so the theory that says, Putin, actually like Yeltsin, was willing to flatten Grozny, therefore he's perfectly happy to flatten Aleppo.
Yeah.
You think that's wrong?
I think Aleppo, given how personal Putin has made the relationship with Hillary Clinton and acrimonious, Aleppo is getting a lot more attention today, and Russia is at a very different stage than the first war in Chechnya.
Absolutely.
At the time, Russia was a democratic sort of liberal state. I mean, I think it was a tragic mistake to go into Chechnya. In the second war, remember, we still thought Putin was a great guy. I mean, Tony Blair was going to opera with Putin in St. Petersburg even before he was elected. They thought, he was the good thing. I mean, I was working at the FT in 2003. I had a conversation with then the editor at the FT, Andrew Gowers, saying, we've got to change our, after Yukos, after Khodorkovsky's arrest. I said, this is not going well. I said, no, come on. I mean, he's the right guy. I mean, he's on the Western side. He called Bush after 2000, September 11. So I think we're in a very different place. I think they will continue in Syria. I don't think they have anything to lose. I think the ideas of imposing no-fly zone over Syria is now, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think America has any force to do that. I think there will be change. We might see a change in their policy towards Ukraine, which will not make Ukraine any better off. I think what Putin will do is they will stop actually fighting. They will try to push this poisonous sort of separatist region back inside Ukraine. And Ukraine being half dysfunctional, corrupt state, with Donbass, this area inside Ukraine, plus all the militia groups roaming around the country, full of arms. His hope is that Ukraine just will not be able to sustain this whole mixed cocktail and will implode. So we're not going to see a more peaceful Russia. No. But I think some of the tactics might change.
Ezgi.
Yeah. Because, at the start of the Syrian civil war, Turkey's stance was mainly ousting Assad. But it turned out that it's not going to happen. So there was an editorial from a pro-government newspaper last week saying that you should not read Russia-Turkey rapprochement as there is a common ground in Syria. But I think this is not the case. Even though Turkish government is not saying explicitly that they shifted its idea from not having Assad go to not having a Kurdish autonomous rule, I think because, and also Erdogan, like Putin, is a man of emotion and pragmatism rather than ideology and principle. I mean, I think the Assad thing has not on the list anymore. And, when it comes to, making it, turn it into an internal discourse, Erdogan is a great rhetoric. I mean, when Russia annexed Crimea, there was actually no sanctions or nothing coming out from Turkey. Turkey, flaunted itself as for long as the protector of the Crimean Tatars, who are the decadents. So it's more like pragmatism, but also that kind of pragmatic relationships are also very volatile, right?
My final question before I invite the audience: where does Iran fit into that equation?
Yes, I will.
The other country that thought that Assad was its client.
Yes, I will have to read you a very fresh pro-government newspaper editorial now. The Turkey-Iran-Russia consensus on Syria has put a spanner in the Atlantic game. They immediately shifted the focus to Mosul. It is more difficult for the trio to achieve a consensus on Iraq. So that's why the West, you guys, did this.
Me?
Just to get attention from a consensus that was built between. So the aim is to bring Iran and Turkey head to head, so that this consensus, the Russian-Turkey rapprochement, does not create any harm for the West. So that's our conspiracy.
That's the latest.
Yes,
conspiracy
that's
theory.
it.
But
yeah.
We'll come back to whether or not what the real story is about Iran. Let me invite, though, before we run on too long, who wants to start in the audience? Okay, over here, please. And could you say just briefly who you are?
Ollie Blake, Blavatnik School of Government. Thank you very much for the discussion. I've got a question that links 3 points. In the article, John Sawyer's article this morning, he finished by saying, we need to look at the world as it is, not as we would want it. And that links to something that Malcolm Rifkind spoke to us about a couple of nights ago. He was looking at Russia and saying that he was concerned about the widespread of, the widespreading of disinformation and propaganda throughout Europe, which finally links into something that General Graham Lamb put into the CMEC briefing this morning, saying that NATO must now stand up and deal with a lot of this asymmetric warfare that Russia is propagating throughout Europe. So my question is, whether it's from a weak or a strong Russia, we know that disinformation is being spread through political parties, charities, and NGOs around Europe. What must we do about it, and is that NATO's role?
We'll come. Can I take a couple of questions, but I've made a note of that. What must be done? Okay, sir.
Hi, my name is Hotzi from South Africa, master's student here. So South Africa is quite distant from Russia and the crisis in Syria, but I'm now curious about what do you think might be a very abstract question, but what is the role of the media in solving what's happening in Syria? So it's all fine and dandy to simply report back on what's happening on the ground, but how do you actively engage with each other and with the public to come to some sort of resolution, if it is even possible? It's just like a very abstract question, but I'm quite curious.
Okay, role of the media in Syria. Francesco here, and then, actually, let's go to come here, and then we'll go to the lady at the back. She'd walk 2 steps too many.
Yeah, Francesco Grillo, visiting scholar at the St. Antony College. I have a question for Arkady. Up to what extent, in your opinion, is Russia regime finalized to maximize the wealth of very few individuals, few plutocrats, which, by the way, have a very strong connection with the rest of the world? And therefore, up to what extent could be a smart tactic to chirurgically hit these people and command and control chain towards large energy companies, etc.
Okay, and then final in this round, the lady at the back.
Arkady Ostrovsky, Blavatnik School of Government. Thank you very much, everyone, for this lovely sharing of your viewpoints on the topic. I just want to ask you, don't you reckon, from my personal experience being half Russian and living in the West for most of my life, I've been exposed to all kinds of viewpoints on this issue, of the Russia-West issue. And I've just come to the conclusion that it's not even so much about what is going on, they're just very conflicting interest points. And I think one of the reasons why there cannot be understanding between Russia and the West is the fact that they come from very different interests. So basically, they want to achieve different things. It's both superpowers, as we know, and they want just more power. So how do you see the relation of Russia and West in the future? Do you ever see it as being post-Cold War, or are we always going to remain in this Cold War state? Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Let's take those in a couple of pairs. I mean, maybe Arkady, first, would it be possible to target the sanctions so precise, so focused, so it was such a good focus that they really had more effect? I mean, let's say that you assume, for the sake of argument, that sanctions are a good idea. Let's leave that debate to one side. Is it so targetable in Russia that you could do something with it? And then come on to the interests point that the last questioner has.
So on sanctions, well, we have sanctions in place against those individuals. Those are probably the most effective of the lot. Are they going to lead to a change of regime? No. I would argue the problem is deeper rooted, and I think we have to be very careful not to fool ourselves, as we sort of had done in the late 80s, that once the communist regime is gone and Russia embraces a free market, everything will be just fine. No, it won't be fine. Look, it's a system. There is a very big pool of history. We won't go into that because it's kind of a long discussion. But Russia is not alone. It is a country of what wonderful American economist Douglas North describes as a limited access order. It thrives on the redistribution of rents and of limiting access to the market and resources. And at the moment, it relies on those who sort of, experts on violence. The effort is ultimately the security services to do that. We had the oligarchs in the 90s. We have these guys today. The system survives. The system needs changing. There has to be change of political system. There has to be institutional change. So yes, we can target the individuals, but I don't believe that sanctions can change the root of the problem. And
is it a kind of permanent conflict of interests, basically, between
No.
Russia and others?
Sorry, where do you come from? Half Russian, half Bulgarian. Well, look, it depends on what you call Russia. I mean, it's a very, very serious question, actually. When Yeltsin in '99 walked out of the Kremlin and said to Putin, take care of Russia, it was all very good, except nobody knew what Russia really was. Putin is trying to persuade the country and the world that Russia is a state, that it's all about state power. I would argue, you're Russia. Those people who were on the streets in 2011 and 12 were Russia. Are you any different from the West? Do you really have that different interest from the West? No. Do I? I was born there. No, I don't. Most of my friends don't. So it depends of how you define Russia. And I think Russians are no different species. They are part of European culture. They had been integrated into European culture. Russia in the 90s didn't lash out against the West, not because, as some would make you believe, because Russia was weak. Russia didn't lash out against the West because it didn't feel threatened by the West. And that's the main reason. And that's the main reason why, interestingly, with Turkey, it is very important, because clearly the Russians don't feel threatened by Turkey in the same way as, or China, as they do by the West. So, no, I think if Russia changes, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever why it cannot, not just peacefully, but be completely integrated. In a way, it is already economically integrated in the West.
The media and resolving the
Yes.
conflict in Syria. What
Well, actually-
can the media do? Should the media do?
Yeah, I mean, in Turkish media, starting in 2011, we went there and see it on the ground. But then after a point, this Syrian war had become a serious tool for Erdogan's government. It has become a domestic issue, which any criticism of the Syrian policy or what is happening to Kurds in there, or just even to get an interview with Assad, which is totally legitimate for a newspaper, would end up that journalist being under a slander campaign in social media as a Ba'athist, as a coup lover, as a Islamophobic, and so it just and seriously, there were moments that government, the crackdown of the government was so bad that actually Turkish people stopped going there, and we just sat on the border of Syria and in Antep and just report that, in Kamışlı we see a smoke coming out, which is ridiculous. I mean, but in the age of digital journalism and also the crackdown from governments can be you can go around that through all of those vehicles called Periscope, social media, but I'm not sure about really sanctioning. I mean, this is also a business. I mean, we cannot really assume that it's not costly to journalists and to newspapers. So there's also a realistic point in that sense. So many of the big outlets, even your newspaper, we cannot afford to be there. So if you're not there, you just get all those misinformations. We're trying to follow amok through Telegram to understand what ISIS is planning, which wasn't like that 10 years ago. So it's just, we are having a challenge as journalists. And you know, this is our professional challenge, but it also affects the public, obviously, because we have a duty to, you know, give the best and quickest and the most accurate information to all of you guys, which seems like we're not doing it well.
It's very hard,
And as your newspaper put it rightly, we're in the post-truth era, which doesn't only apply to Brexit or Trump, but also what is going on in the sectarian war in Syria. You know, now all the powers have proxies there. So it's just very hard if you're not there to recognize the depth of, for example, atrocity in Aleppo. To see
Absolutely.
that rubbles and 100,000 kids there.
Yeah, no, it is very hard, and people get desensitized to it as well, which is an unfortunate part. Now, I'm going to hold the question about what must be done as our kind of final contribution. I want another round of questions from the room, please. Microphone.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a student at the Blavatnik School. So my question is actually stemming from what you just said. So not so long ago, you saw Turkey trying to portray itself, or at least that was my perception of whatever I read at that time, as a nation state that was trying to be an ideal or a bridge between the East and the West. So you had Davutoglu's Look East policy, you know, you had the zero problems with the neighbor policy, and over the last few years, everything has eroded, and now the entire perception of Turkey has shifted. Do you think there is any going back to even that vague idea of Turkey being a secular, liberal democracy that's somewhere been able to bridge the religion and liberalism and democracy and, you know, having a public opinion and a strong state?
Hold on that. We might have to set up a separate seminar on that as well. But let's go there and there.
Hi, my name is Salman. I'm from Blavatnik School of Government as well. I have two questions that are not unrelated. The first is some arguments out there put forward by people like Henry Kissinger put the blame on the West in terms of provoking Russia's reaction and really undermining, not understanding what you spoke about, which is the sense of vulnerability that Russia has always had, that comes from its geography, its unique geography. The second, do you agree with that, first of all? And the second question is, to what extent is Russia's strategy in Syria a bargaining chip for its objectives in Ukraine? Or is Syria a standalone objective in terms of, you know, preserving its power base there? Thank you.
Okay, great. Over.
Annika Weids, also from the Blavatnik School of Government. My question relates to the legislation that came into place regarding surveillance in Russia, and in particular Snowden, who critiqued it in quite a strong way, calling it the dark day when it came into force. Like, do you think that Snowden is really a liability for Putin going forwards?
Interesting question. Sir.
My name is Sai from the Blavatnik School as well. My question has to do with the recent campaign in Mosul right now, and we saw I think today was reported, or yesterday, that Peshmerga forces have opened a new front in the north of Mosul, and I was wondering what effect, assuming successful campaign, that would have on Turkish-Western relations, and broadly speaking, maybe Turkish, going back to what you were saying about Turkey-Russia rapprochement and the West.
Okay, I'll take one more, and I think I'm allowed to overrun by about 5 minutes, so that's all right. I can give myself that privilege. Let's go over here, and then actually we'll take two more.
Hi, my name is Safa. I'm also from the Blavatnik School of Government. So we always talk about Russia and the role in Syria, but there is actually also, because I'm from Yemen, there is a role Russia is playing in Yemen. When we watch Russia Today or read some newspapers from Russia, we find them that the rhetoric is almost the same as the rhetoric of the Houthi militias, which are backed by Iran. Yes. And a week ago, American ships has moved towards the Yemeni sea because they were attacked by the Houthi militias. Do you think Russia, with this movement of the American military to Yemen, will play a greater role and more open role in Yemen?
Interesting. Okay, one final question, and then we'll come for some answers.
I would like to ask you about your appreciation of the actual threat that Russia might present to the Baltic states and to Eastern Europe in general. Because during the Warsaw Summit, NATO Summit, there has been a lot of talk about it. All the steps that have been made to, so to say, secure via NATO the Baltic states obviously are more like just a show, just to show that there is some security for them. So do you think that these fears are actually exaggerated in these states? Or, I mean, I'm just wondering, what is the perspective from here, from the UK? Because being from Eastern Europe, the threat is really taking in serious.
And where are you from?
I am from Romania, but I used to work in Poland, and that's probably the country which feels most threatened. So.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's get some answers. I mean, maybe Arkady, start with that question about to what extent should the West be blamed, and to what extent is Syria a bargaining chip of any kind?
I would not exaggerate the role of the West and what happened in Russia, other than to say that the fall of the communism and the end of the Soviet Union was not the result of a military build-up by America. It was not the result of an arms race. It was simply the result of, and that very much actually relates to the whole propaganda thing. It was the result of the fact that the advantages of a capitalist system, both economically and in terms of human rights and dignity, were becoming much and much more obvious. And I think very few people have done more damage to that cause than Henry Kissinger has. I think the idea of pragmatism, the idea of recognizing, we don't live in the 19th century imperial world when Russia was a genuine empire, was multi-ethnic, where Scots, Englishmen, Frenchmen served the Tsar and therefore had sort of great geopolitical interests. I think recognizing that is just not helpful. As I said, Russia was not threatened by NATO in the 90s. What's more, if you actually go and look up what Putin's been saying in the early 2000s about NATO, up to 2004 summit in Bratislava, which accepted the Baltic states into NATO, where he was saying he didn't see the expansion of NATO as a threat. He was absolutely comfortable with it. And this is against the hawks who are saying, oh no, this is terrible, this is infringing on Russian interests. Putin said, yeah, absolutely no problem. What's more, we might actually join NATO ourselves one day. If you stop lecturing us about human rights in Chechnya, very important proviso. So no, I don't think that I think the West has made many mistakes towards Russia, but I don't think these were those mistakes. I think NATO hasn't expanded fast enough and far enough, frankly.
And how worried, so moving on, I'll just go as a small interlude say that one of the memories I cherish most of being in my old job as editor of The Economist was the letters I automatically received from Henry Kissinger in protest every time we published something about him or by him.
Yes.
Every time there would be a protest letter. Anyway, the Baltic...
a polite one.
Not very, no.
No, polite one, you don't even open, you don't even look at those.
So the Baltic states, and Poland, how worried should they be?
I'm worried about Poland, not for the reasons of what Russia might do. I'm worried about what's happening in Poland.
Yeah.
And what the Poles might do. It's not a safe government. Particularly, you don't need lots of flames, matches being lit, right? In terms of the Baltic states, there is a risk. I wouldn't overestimate that risk. I think that having very recently talked to, only 2 days ago, to senior British military and security officials on that issue. I think everybody is very clear about what is to be done. Everybody is very clear, unless, of course, Trump comes to power, in which case all the bets off. But let's say, for now, assume that he isn't coming to power. If we continue with the normal sort of governments and policies and institutions, I think everybody knows what to do in case of Russia's sort of hybrid type operation in the Baltic states. My sense is that the Estonia, all the Baltic countries have a very clear tactic and strategy. You immediately escalate. You start shooting. And clearly, NATO's presence in Baltic states is not enough to defeat Russia, but it's a tripwire. And then once you're in the clear conflict, you are in the Article 5 territory. And that's why I don't think Putin actually is going to go for the Baltic states. And I'm much more worried about those sort of gray zone weaker states. I'm worried about Ukraine. I'm very worried about Belarus. I think that's a very likely next theatre of action. We have absolutely no policy towards it. It's crucial to the Russians, and we're clearly not going to come out screaming, "Oh, what about that nice man, Mr. Lukashenko?"
Okay, Yemen and the Houthis, Ezgi. What do you?
I have no idea about Yemen. Seriously.
Is this? Do you have a sense, an answer to Safa's question? I mean, is it?
No, the Russians are clearly sort of moving sort of further into their sort of traditional spheres in the Middle East. I don't have any real. I'm totally out of my depth on what they're doing in Yemen.
Exactly.
To be honest, for all it's worth, I mean, the Russians also are constrained by a very, very important relationship with Israel. So I think it's. The Russians are not going to do something that really upsets Israel and Yemen.
But does it come back to how close are they with Iran, or is Iran a rival?
I think they're worried about Iran. I don't think they understand Iran. It's not a traditional partner.
No.
So, they played for sort of pragmatic. Yes, it can be, what I've just read, the editorial, Iran, Turkey, Russia axis.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Turkey and Russia, definitely. That's the most interesting relationship to me. Sorry, I didn't answer the question about bargaining chips. I think very briefly, what Putin wants is a new security architecture in Europe. He's mostly worried about Eastern Europe and Russia's and the former Soviet Union. I wouldn't say these are just bargaining chips. I think that would be too simple, but it's obviously trying to project Russia's power, trying to force America to talk to the Russians, recognize their sphere of influence. And the new incumbent in the White House, we'll have to sit down with the Russians and talk about it, because, to me, the really worrying thing is not propaganda. To me, the most worrying thing is Putin's overconfidence, their brandishing of the nuclear arms,
Yes.
Their readiness to throw nuclear into a political mix, which is something that Soviets had never done, not since 1962. And to me, that's a much greater threat than all others. And I think we have to take it seriously.
And so, okay, let's finish, because I know I actually do have to vacate this room, unfortunately. We could, I think, talk about a long time.
I had questions.
Yes. What are your questions?
No, I mean, directed to me.
Oh, yes, you did. Answer them quickly. And then we moved on to what should be done.
Okay. Regarding Mosul, I have to say that...
Mosul, yes.
Yeah, 3 days ago, President Erdogan allegedly say to the cabinet that this is a time, quote unquote, when Turkey will either expand or shrink. So in the internal politics, there's an irredentist discourse. And because the army's image is so tarnished because of the coup attempt, I think in the Mosul offensive, Turkey just want to have a say on the table. Nothing more in terms of realpolitik. But you have to realize this irredentist rhetoric resonates well in Turkish public. And this, a Russian rapprochement also, is a leverage for Erdogan against the West. And what should the West do is, for example, when it comes to Turkey, it's not only sticks and carrots. You can't think of it as in binary terms. I mean, there's an authoritarian, illiberal leadership, and the human rights violation and crackdown on media and freedom of speech should be voiced not occasionally, but in an institutionalized manner. But also, for example, Turkey in the last 3 months had seriously gone through a trauma which was not really understood by the West. If it weren't for the West's indifference to the idea of this Gülen threat, which actually had an unprecedented consensus in the Turkish public of 90%. I mean, that would mean because there are common interests of trade with Russia, this rapprochement was inevitable. But this is more than an economic rapprochement, and this will put a huge strain upon Turkey-Western relationships, which obviously Putin benefits.
So, just to close,
I think I closed it.
well, I'm not letting you off that easily. So, policy towards Russia. Arkady is an advisor to the new American president. You are an advisor to President Erdogan. How do you approach
Highly
Russia?
unlikely.
Yeah, no, indeed. But I'm not sure Arkady is on the list for the Clinton administration either. Maybe he is.
Definitely not.
So, in brief, as somebody, an analyst of Russia said, something I heard last week, tough is not a policy. What is
That's a good one.
what is a policy? What would you say to the new administration?
Okay, so few bits. 4 perhaps. First, keep a very cool head. Keep very calm and assess the state of Russia and what drives it to what it does. Understand those weaknesses. Understand it's a weak power, which doesn't mean it's safe. That's number 1. Number 2, don't build Russia into a bogeyman, and don't hyperventilate. Don't turn it into a monster, because that's exactly what Putin wants you to feel. He is acting as in that sense, for the want of a better word, as a terrorist. He wants to spread terror. He wants to blackmail you. And as in dealing with any such threat, you have to keep very, very calm. As dealing with any such threat, you also have to engage with the terrorist threat. If you have somebody taking up hostages and threatening to blow them up, you go and talk to them. You have no other option. Walking away and saying, you don't matter, we don't care about what you say, we're not going to engage with you, is irresponsible. So we need to sit, you need to sit down, Madam Secretary, Madam, what do we call it? Madam President.
Hopefully.
Madam President, you have to sit down with them, and your first and real objective is to separate nuclear from all other issues. Try as hard as you can. We don't know how it goes. It's not going to be easy, because Putin clearly wants to throw it into the mix. But separating nuclear from all others is essential. And the fourth is, I'm afraid, it's back to canon. You have to contain. You have to contain Russia's aggression in the former Soviet republics. In terms of propaganda, which came up, and which is obviously what gets the US media going, this disinformation campaign. Look, let's be clear about one thing. Propaganda only works in Russia or outside Russia or any other country. One condition only: if the audience is prepared to believe it, if it's receptive to it. If the audience is not receptive, no amount of propaganda is going to work. We've seen this in the Soviet Union. The Soviets been bombarding their own citizens with propaganda. Didn't work. People went to the shops, saw empty shelves. Doesn't work. The Russians believe it for their own psychological, historical, traumatic reasons. Much bigger worry is that the Western audience now seems to be sort of much more receptive to it. Russian propaganda is different from the Soviet in that they're not trying to prove that they're better. they're trying to sort of lower the common denominator and say everybody is the same as us. Everybody is hypocritical, everybody is cynical, everybody is corrupt, everybody is rigged. And therefore, look at the sham of the elections in the US. It has no institutions. And I do believe that you can have wonderful technologies and you can build all sorts of firewalls, cyber firewalls, but the only thing that really works is if you make the public aware of what your counterparts, what your opponents are doing, and you have your own resolve. If we don't have that resolve in the West, if we don't have self-confidence, then no amount of technology is going to help us, because you can't, in this day and age with digital information, you can't stop the flows, and they will find their own channel. So it's only building the immunity inside that can protect you. But that's not a job for the Russians to do. I mean, that's a job for us in the West to do. And at the moment, we're in a very difficult spot.
Okay, you're hired. Now, so the last 10 seconds, because we really have to go.
Okay.
You're a lost cause with President Erdogan. I know. But
my first advice would be please treat journalists as journalists, not terrorists.
Yep.
And secondly, the main thing is Russian rapprochement is good, but the Western train is where Turkey needs to be, and not socially, economically, and culturally. If you want to gain power and be legitimate in the eyes of the world, please resolve this Kurdish issue. Kurdish issue is your soft tummy, and you need to make peace with your Kurds and also help Syrian Kurds to build their self-governing, because that's the only way to have a peaceful borderline, which is good for the West, which is good for your country, which is good for humanity, because these people deserve a chance to have a self-rule, which is very legitimate.
Magnificent.
I'm not hired.
That's it. No. That's very good advice.
You are by the Kurds.
You are by the Kurds, exactly. So we will come back to Turkey on another occasion. But meanwhile, let me thank all of you for being here. Tell you that in 2 weeks' time, when we do another one of these, we're talking about the Colombian peace deal and the referendum rejection with another great panel. But I want to thank Arkady and Ezgi for a fantastic, very rich conversation. Thank you.
Thank you too.